So, Guru, having looked at various aspects of the industry and so on, help us understand what are the factors that cause volatility in prices of the grains, right? And how do you manage those risks? I know we made some references in the introductory part, but maybe here's a time we could look at it a little more detail to understand what causes the volatility and how do you manage the risks?
Thanks, Venkat. We've spoken earlier about the big picture factors that causes price changes from season to season, which is principally the supply and demand structure.
Right.
When you talk of price volatility, by definition, you're talking of a shorter time frames.
Right.
These time frames can be across months, they can be, or they can be across days, or they can be even intraday.
Correct.
Principally, there are a few factors that cause price volatility. I think the biggest one is weather. Weather impacts, and weather not just as in whether it's too hot or too wet, but weather also in terms of the timing.
Okay.
All crops need a certain weather pattern. They need sufficient subsoil moisture at the time of planting. They need a certain weather pattern during different stages of growth. They need rain sometimes, they need sunlight sometimes, they need heat sometime during its growing cycle. And they need a certain weather at harvest. And they need a certain weather to facilitate storage and movement of grain from the fields into storage facilities. So I think weather is the biggest, has the biggest impact in the growing cycle. And then weather by nature, by definition, you have crops growing in both the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere, where the growing seasons are contra. So they're opposite in nature. And therefore, at any point in time, you will always have weather being an influence on short-term price volatility. Whether arising from the northern hemisphere growing season or from the southern hemisphere growing season. Then you have natural disasters or logistical disruptions. COVID was an example. Now, strangely enough, COVID was a factor that caused prices to rally during Q2 and Q3. And that was principally because supply chain disruptions caused a lot of fear in different consuming nations that they would run out of food. They would run out of grain for their industry, for their feed production. And therefore, governments incentivized importers to go and buy and not run hand to mouth to have adequate 3 to 4 month protection. So there was a massive surge of demand, not justified by pure demand S&D, macro S&D demand requirements. And that naturally will cause the short-term volatility in prices. We saw 20% move across the board in our grain prices during that period. Then you have government policy changes that impact price. For instance, India is the biggest importer of vegetable oils in the world. And vegetable oils falls under 2 categories. They're either what's called soft oils or they're palm-based products. Palm-based products are principally Malaysia, Indonesia from origin. And soft oils are canola, sunflower, soybean oil, corn oil, and everything in that category. Now, India, because the vegetable oil goes directly into the human food chain without an intermediate stage, the government tends to tweak duty structures, either to favor soft oils or to favor palm oil. And therefore, that causes imbalances in the prices, or the price relationships between different components of vegetable oil. So that's an example of how a government intervention and government policies can impact price volatility. Then you have if you have structural demand changes that are anticipated or unanticipated. For instance, the Chinese demand for maize and corn in 2019-20 in that season, where China from being a zero, almost a zero, and not a materially significant importer of corn, this year is estimated to import 40 million tons. Now, by nature, prices tend to anticipate structural changes in demand. And when that demand actually takes place, or when it actually gets materialized, then prices either remain stable, or if that demand doesn't materialize or doesn't materialize in the scale that was anticipated that the price reflected, will again cause changes and adjustments in the price. So these are factors that all of which in combination or individually affect price volatility.
One more before we move to the risks, just a question. You also talked about money flow in the earlier part of our discussion, and where you talked about hedge funds and others who look at these as asset classes and they make investments in these things. So reading the market based on supply, demand, balance sheet, and so on that we talked about now, if they read an opportunity and they invest, and then that can also push price in a particular direction, right? So that is also will cause volatility or accentuate the direction which is moving, which will further accelerate the volatility in either direction. Is that possible or not possible?
That's what I was coming to. I think that is one of the biggest factors in price volatility, and has been so, especially in the last decade, is the sheer velocity of money in and out of the markets.
Correct.
And that causes huge spikes. It can accentuate, like you rightly said, it can accentuate an already existing situation, or it can take price volatility, price movements in a different direction altogether because of the sheer scale. So yes, it is a huge impact, especially in today's markets, and that's why it's so difficult to deal with parts, factors that influence price that are not determined or that are not driven by pure fundamentals alone.
Pure fundamentals.
So
for us in the business, go ahead. Sorry.
So for us in the business, we have to wear multiple hats. At times we have to be meteorologists. At times we have to be, data analysts. At times we have to track. We have to be financial. We have to have an idea of what's happening in the financial markets, because all of which have an impact on price.
Wonderful summary of what a trader's job is. And I think this will be a great line for, youngsters who want to enter the trade to understand that what it is, that the skill sets and what the knowledge base that they need to have. So you mentioned that it can also move, these money flows can also move in a different direction.
Yeah.
Offhand, can you give an example, which is a different direction from wherever it was sort of like heading to?
Okay. If let's say, and I'll just use this in a very simple example rather than make it too technical or complicated.
Sure.
If you have an S&D, a supply and demand structure that tells you that the fair price of corn is $200.
Okay.
Now, $200 is reflected on the futures exchange, which is the CME.
Right.
But then CME has, there's just as you have in the stock markets, there is a certain volume that trades every day.
True.
And that volume is a function of how much money is deployed into the market that day.
Correct.
Now, when you have managed money come in that spikes volumes up dramatically during a day, for whatever causative factor is there at the back end, whether it's a readjustment of portfolio rebalancing or whatever at the fund level. But when a market that normally trades let's say 100,000 contracts a day, and you suddenly get a flow of 200,000 to 300,000 contracts traded in that day, you will tend to start trending the markets in a direction away from what is fair value.
Right. Okay, that's what you're referring to.
Yeah. So ultimately, markets are what we call mean reverting. They tend to find a state of equilibrium, but in that process of discovery, you go through a lot of ups and downs.
Right. So how do you manage these risks?
Well, you manage risks. Firstly, you have different skill sets that you need. You need to be a meteorologist. You need to be an agronomist. You need to know. You need to have a very strong data analytics team.
Right.
Research, and research not just for information's sake or reading reports, etc. Most of the companies today have cutting edge research where you have research departments that will constantly analyze and make daily forecasts or adjustments in their balance sheets on a real-time basis that enables you to trade off the conclusions of those changes or to rebalance your positions.
Right. So we need to be lower on this, so let's sell whatever X plus whatever, right? In a generic sense.
In a very
or other way around, we are short. We need. We don't have enough.
You need to be selling in Argentina. You need to be buying in the US.
Buying in, right.
So product relative values of products.
Correct. Okay.
So first is to equip yourself with the skill sets, or have a team that you need to know financials, what the financial industry is doing. You need to track what hedge funds are doing, what index funds are doing. You need to be able to track the amount of what we call a technical term called open interest in contracts in the futures markets. You need to be a technical analyst too. You need to know volatility. You need to know options. You need to know the technical factors that impact options and futures. So that's on the skill set side. Then you come to your own space. Now, ultimately, a proper risk management approach, simplistically put, is defined as what your objective is to define where do you draw the line, how much money can I afford to lose,
right,
without causing a material disruption in my business. How much money can I afford to lose on a short-term basis or on a long-term basis, and what is my risk-reward scenario? Is it asymmetrical, skewed more towards reward? And that enables you to define set limits for different parts of your business. So you would put quantitative limits, or you would use mathematical tools. Like one of the tools that is commonly used in the industry is called a value at risk approach, VAR as we call it. So VAR is simply a statistical estimation of what is the 95 or the 99% probability that you will get more than a one standard deviation move in prices.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So you define, in simplistically put, it is a measure of how much money, basis your current position and your book structure on that day. It's a mathematical calculation of how much money can you potentially gain or lose, depending on which way the market moves, within a one standard deviation.
Right.
It can never be 100% because by very definition, it's a probability. So you work on a 95% probability or 99% probability, and that's how. So you define your VAR limits, and you can define your VAR limits and break it down into different parts of the business. And have very strong controls. So there needs to be oversight into what the traders are doing. And there needs to be discipline. I think the biggest issue is discipline. And that is something that comes from within. So systems are only there to help you to the extent that you yourself are disciplined in your approach.
Right.
And so it's
So
completely
tell us
data
a little,
driven.
right. Tell us a little bit about the hedging that you do,
Well,
or a trader would do. Um,
hedging is simply a means of price protection in a volatile market environment.
right.
Uh, that's what it simplistically means. So if you were to buy a X product at $100 a ton for use, by the time you transform it from an origin to a destination, you're talking of time. So there's time
Right.
value.
Right.
So how do you protect yourself that 1 month from today, when the product reaches your factory, that the price is, what happens if the price goes to 150 or it goes to 50?
50. Yeah.
So you would tend to take contra positions
Mm-hmm.
in a futures exchange
Mm-hmm.
to your physical purchases
Mm-hmm.
that would enable you to offset that risk.
Mm-hmm.
It would bring, exactly what your financial exposure is. So if prices go up,
Mm-hmm.
you hold product at 100 whose value is 150,
Yeah.
but you have an opposite position on the futures exchange where you lose that gain. The net sum still means that your product is priced at 100.
Right. Right. Right.
And that's how you manage.
That's how you manage
The,
your
in
risks.
simplistically, this is what a hedge is. A hedge is taking an opposite position of your mainline business that
Right.
insulates you to a certain extent from price risk, or
Right.
it removes the variability of prices in your inputs. So for a
Right.
consumer, he would hedge to make sure that his input prices do not fluctuate on a day. He knows exactly what the weighted average cost of his purchases are.
Yeah. So the bread manufacturer needs to know what floor prices you would have throughout the year, so that can go into their costing, right? In
Yeah.
very simple terms. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we talked about volatility at length. Uh, we talked about prices. So what are the other factors that cause uncertainty in grain business? Climate is certainly one. So are there some things that you have wanted to add to, or some, you've talked about climate at different stages of our today's discussion. There are a few other climate factors, El Nino effect and so on.
Well,
So do you want to?
the biggest one really that I think people should have some insight, again,
Mhm.
without getting too much into detail, is
Mm.
the phenomenon of El Nino and La Nina.
Right.
and uh, and that has, people talk of climate change and similar factors, global warming in a very general sense. But El Nino and La Nina are two phenomena opposite. They have the opposite effect,
Correct.
uh, and they are principally caused by temperature fluctuations in the
Hmm.
sea surface
Okay.
temperature fluctuations between the sea surface and the atmosphere in the equatorial Pacific region, which
Right.
specifically means from the international date line to 120 degrees west. So strip aside the technicals, it basically means off the coast of Peru and Chile.
Right.
That's where it
Right.
originates from. It's uh, it's a phenomenon that's been existing, that's been in place for since 16, 1700s. We're talking 300, 400-year-old structures. But
Mm.
people have never understood it. And they only
Mm.
started to gain prominence, or, we started to develop a better understanding in the last
Mm.
10 to 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what it does is, long story short, it has a huge impact on weather across the globe.
Right.
And an El Nino event is classified as, in layman language, it's warm, where the surface temperatures are warmer than the atmospheric conditions.
Right.
Uh, and La Nina is the opposite. What does it cause the impact, which is more
Mm.
important? So the
Mm.
impact of El Nino typically is, it uh, it lasts between 9 to 12 months
Mm-hmm.
every time it occurs. It's variable. There's no consistency,
Mm.
uh, and it can be between 2 and 7 years between two respective events.
Mm.
So the last
Okay.
event we had was in 2016. We haven't had a significant El Nino or a La Nina event, a strong event.
Glad that it wasn't there in 2020. We had enough of other problems.
Well, we are probably, we have, what's called an Enso oscillation index. So
Right.
El Nino Southern Oscillation Index, and it's an index that measures the probability that you will
Right.
have an El Nino or a La Nina year. And
Okay.
the probability is starting to trend towards a La Nina year. Now,
Wow. Okay.
again, coming back to the impact of this, and ultimately it impacts weather, which impacts crop sizes, which impacts supply and demand balance sheet structures, which impacts prices, which
Right.
impacts correlations between different commodities.
Mm-hmm.
And this has a huge impact. So in the US, it means you get a much wetter and south and a drier north. And I'm covering specific countries and regions that are important from an agronomy point of view, because this is where the bulk of the supply side is. In Canada, it causes a wet western part of Canada and a wet central part. In Argentina, in the growing cycle, it starts off as dry and then ends with a wetter finish. So you have to manage both. You got to ensure that there's enough subsoil moisture
Right.
at the start, and you got to ensure that your harvest is not, you don't lose yield or you don't lose crop because of floods and
And yet to see if we
during
can
the
protect
harvest.
them.
In Brazil, it's a wetter South Brazil and a drier North Brazil, and you have Brazil is a huge country, so you have crops growing all the way from south to the north, so it can cause major imbalances. In Australia, generally causes a hot and dry season. So these are all El Nino events. In Asia, generally it causes dryness. In India, it causes heat and dryness. So this is the impact of an El Nino event, and it can impact one entire crop cycle. And La Nina is you just flip it, and that's the impact of La Nina. So in Asia, you will have a much wetter growing. You'll have a lot more rain, that things that you don't anticipate. I don't know, maybe what we see nowadays is
a
small,
forerunner.
who knows, but
Who knows,
that's
right.
typically what you see when you get these things that you've never been used to in the past. Massive floods everywhere, massive droughts everywhere. Usually they all originate back from the El Nino, the La Nina phenomenon.
Right. Very interesting. Thanks for people periodically hear about these, but it's good to understand them much better. Thanks. One of the things which I recently read, sort of like was eye-opening for me, that and in the previous question you talked about global warming, so that's where I'm sort of leading with this, that what I read is that one of the unintended consequences of global warming can be that that Eastern Russia, the Siberian Russia, will become more arable, and they will have more arable land, and Russia will start developing more of its agriculture, so it's not doesn't end at the the wheat granary and the granary in Ukraine and that region, but it further extends significantly into the east of Russia, and they would be able to develop its agriculture and export grains. So obviously it can increase supply or take care of any shortfalls. So any thoughts on this matter?
Personally, I don't believe that despite global warming, I don't believe that the eastern part of Russia or in the Siberia or that Vladivostok, that side, will ever be arable. At least not in our lifetimes, maybe not even in the next generation too, because these changes happen very slowly. So we're talking 50, 100 years, who knows?
But haven't there been some reports that across the China-Russia border, some lands have become more arable, and people are
to the in a small scale way, possible in pockets, not in a materially significant way so as to impact global business, and certainly will not have the kind of yield structure that would make it economical. So
okay.
it could be done for to somebody, the government wants to make a point. Okay, it's possible. I could take 20 acres and do something with it and say that, yes, it's possible. But it's not a materially significant influencing factor.
Okay.
But having said that, the Eastern European countries is where the next phase of growth is going to come from. Rather, they're already big now, and they're becoming an increasingly important part of global trade, because you have pretty much maxed out to a large extent acreages in the US and in South America, where the the industry is pretty mature.
Right.
In Brazil, of course, there is still the push towards the Amazon, so to clear out land, and that causes another issue with environmental factors. But that's where the acreage is. Otherwise, you're pretty much maxed out. Unless you go into the Amazon, you more or less maxed out your acreage, give or take a few. So the question is on a much broader scale. If you have to keep up the supply pace, the pace of supply or the growth of supply to the growth of demand, where is that extra acreage going to come from? Now, that's where the Black Sea regions, so you're talking of all the Central Asian nations, all the stans, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, etc., plus Ukraine and Russia in the region around the Black Sea.
Right.
That is where the huge growth on the supply side is going to come from, materially significant. It's already there, been there for the last 10, 15 years. But then there's another factor to keep in mind, which is it's one thing to have growth in supply, but it's also another thing to transform that from the origin to the destination, i.e., meaning you've got to have facilities and infrastructure to be able to consolidate, store that, bring that to the ports, put it on ships and take it somewhere else. And that takes time and it needs huge investments. And that's what's really been happening.
Will the Silk Road initiative, will that
it cannot
benefit?
be by land. It cannot be by land. It has to be by sea, because that is the cheapest way of transportation. Land transportation is one of the most expensive ways of transforming product or moving it from point A to point B. And certainly not in the sizes that the world needs.
Right. So these are some interesting thoughts about like where we are, where the world could go, or where the grain business could go. So that leads us to, what would be your closing thoughts in terms of like outlook over the next 5 years or so, or you longer, you take the timeline, I'll be flexible on that. And do you see shortages, oversupply, with these countries coming in, and weather phenomenon? How do you see these things playing out, balancing each other?
I think the world is pretty resilient in the sense that the market, we always say, is mean reverting, meaning that the market always, the supply and demand factors go through a transition phase, and its focal point is to find equilibrium.
Right.
Now, in that process, you could have disruptions, you could have imbalances that create price volatility. But the function of prices and price volatility is to bring markets back to mean reverting. So the factors that are controllable, so the things that I see the direction in which the industry will move, and in a very broad way, is you will have major improvements or focus on forecasting.
Okay. That's good.
Crop cycles, for instance, using satellites maps to determine subsoil moistures, as an instance, to determine where you will plant the next crop.
Correct.
Right? You will have a greater study and more accuracy on meteorology. So, for instance, some of the grain trading companies, one of my previous company, we employed 3 meteorologists whose only job was day in and day out was to study weather maps and disseminate that information. And then you had a set of data analytics guys who would transform that information into numbers on which people could make decisions on.
Right. So Are you heading towards an internal weather channel on Slack?
No, I don't think it'll get to that stage, but well, so you will have more and more sophistication in forecasting. You will
Right.
have major investment in approaches in data analytics.
Right.
You will have ultimately the work. There's only so much of land, so it's a question of how efficiently you use it, or how much juice you can squeeze out of what is already available. So if you're talking technology changes that would, let's say, materially impact, would cause a 30%, 40% increase in supply. I don't believe we're there as yet. I mean, it probably needs to be an Einstein type discovery if something happens like that. But also, I don't believe that is warranted, because ultimately your supply is only to meet an equilibrium level of demand.
Right.
And to ensure food security. I think food security concerns with these weather changes is also going to be a major factor. Governments are increasingly getting concerned about food security.
Food security, yes.
Yes. You will continue to have developments in seed research, better quality seeds, more resistant seeds, more yield-bearing seeds, agronomy practices also likewise. So the areas that will influence production, reduce losses through better handling systems is the direction I believe the industry is going. Also, one important factor that I see the industry moving forward, and I have no idea how far it will succeed, which is there's a huge move among the majors to move towards a paperless system of documentation.
Right.
Through the use of blockchain technologies. And right now it's purely in an experimental stage.
True.
But
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's what people are actually starting to think about, not just think about, actually start to implement.
So at least consumer at the other end can know where were the origins and where were the processing and et cetera, right?
Not identity
and
tracing.
For the industry itself to know.
Not identity tracing really, but more in terms of today you need, when you transform or when you ship a product from point A to point B, there's a certain set of documents, certain government documents, certain invoices,
absolutely.
etc. All those today, by the time it takes between 15 to 20 days by the time it goes from one place to another place, because it has to get produced as a physical paper. It has to go through your own internal processing systems, through the banking system to the consumer. So that takes time. So the idea is to bring more efficiency into the whole process by using blockchain, but then there's many parts of it that still have to be implemented. But it's a direction that the industry could move to. Personally, I have my doubts as to how long that would take and to what extent you could incorporate that in a very basic industry like ours. But time will tell.
Okay, that's a wonderful note to point to end this discussion and bring it to a close. Thank you, Guru, for excellent insights on how the grain business operates, what are the challenges, what are the factors that cause price changes, volatility, uncertainty, climate impact, and at different stages and towards the end we talked about various kinds of technological impacts that are that your industry is facing and the transformation that it is undergoing. Wonderful insights. And listeners, subscribe to MoVeConversations as well as our new channel in that, TradeStuff, where Guru kicked it off, and then we would have others to follow this. And so please do tune in and stay subscribed to our channels.
Thank you very much, Venkat. Thank you very much for having me on this program, and I hope it tickles a few imaginations and gives a bit more insight into what the industry is at a practical level.
Oh, I'm very
sure. For students
or
for practitioners or whoever. So thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us in yet another episode of Move Conversations. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe to the Move Conversations YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get notifications of new episodes. Thank you very much. Till I see you in the next episode. Thank you very much. Have a great day.